Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. U proteklih nekoliko godina jedna zemlja Evropske unije i članica NATO saveza direktno se umiješala u gotovo svaki sukob na Bliskom istoku i sjeveru Afrike. U Siriji je podržavala i naoružavala pobunjenike u borbi protiv autokratskog lidera. U Libiji podržava i naoružava autokratskog lidera u borbi protiv međunarodno priznate vlade. Podržava jednu članicu NATO saveza protiv druge u borbi za kontrolu nad resursima istočnog Mediterana. Uspostavila je vojne baze u Ujedinjenim Arapskim Emiratima, Libiji, Maliju i Džibutiju. Razvila je prisne odnose sa autokratskim arapskim liderima i vojnim huntama. Prodaje im napredno oružje, kupuje jeftinu naftu i sarađuje po pitanju borbe protiv ekstremizma. Riječ je o Francuskoj. U ovom izdanju emisije analiziramo kakvu ulogu želi Francuska na Bliskom istoku. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima, pogledajmo uvodni prilog. U jeku kampanje bojkota francuskih proizvoda koja se vodi u muslimanskim zemljama, egipatski predsjednik Abdel Fattah el-Sisi posjetio je Francusku, gdje se sastao sa predsjednikom te države Emmanuelom Macronom. Lideri dvije zemlje su razgovarali o raznim temama kao što su sigurnost, odbrana, borba protiv terorizma, sukob u Libiji i drugim regionalnim temama. Macron je ranije priznao da između njega i predsjednika Egipta postoji neslaganja u nekim pitanjima, kao što su ljudska prava, ali je rekao da neće biti prepreka za postizanje dogovora koji se odnosi na ekonomiju i odbranu. Brojni demonstranti u Parizu su zamjerili francuskom predsjedniku Emmanuelu Macronu zbog toga što je postavio crveni tepih za lidera Egipta, za koje kažu da krši ljudska prava i pritvara pripadnike opozicije. Nevladine organizacije procjenjuju da se u egipatskim zatvorima nalazi više od 60.000 političkih zatvorenika. Ipak, Macron je kazao da francusku prodaju oružja Egiptu neće vezivati za stanje ljudskih prava u toj zemlji, jer ne želi oslabiti sposobnost Kaira u borbi protiv terorizma. Francuska ima veliki interes na Bliskom istoku i sjeveru Afrike. To nije ništa novo. Imala ga je još od vremena Napoleona Bonapartea krajem 18. vijeka i više decenijske okupacije i kolonizacije arapskih i afričkih zemalja. Taj utjecaj zadržan je i danas. Francuski je službeni jezik u brojnim sjeverno- i zapadnoafričkim zemljama. 10% stanovništva Francuske ili blizu 6,6 milijuna stanovnika je arapskog porijekla, dok 1,2 milijuna francuskih državljana živi u arapskim zemljama. Sjever Afrike je glavni izvor migranata u Francuskoj. Zapravo, 80% migranata dolazi iz Alžira, Maroka i Tunisa, bivših kolonija. Također, 80% stranih studenata u Francuskoj porijeklom je sa sjevera Afrike i Bliskog istoka. Francuskoj je jednako bitno šta se nalazi pod zemljom. Libija, Irak kao i obale Libana i Kipra bogati su naftom i plinom. Libija ima najveće zalihe nafte u Africi i pete po veličini zalihe prirodnog plina. Upravo zbog toga je i veliki interes francuske državne firme Total da dobije povoljne koncesije za crpljenje nafte u tim zemljama. Total crpi naftu i plin iz Alžira, Libije, Egipta, Mauritanije, Senegala, Nigerije, obale Slonovače, Angole i Iraka. Prva zvanična posjeta predsjednika Macrona izvan Evropske unije bila je Maliju, gdje je stacionirano 1600 francuskih vojnika. Sjeverna Afrika bitna je i Francuskoj i Evropskoj uniji. Evropska unija uvozi 23,4% metalnih ruda i minerala iz Mauritanije. Iz Nigera se uvozi 20% uranija za 58 nuklearnih elektrana u Francuskoj koje proizvode 75% energije te zemlje. Sahel je također glavni izvor neregularnih migracija prema Evropskoj uniji, pa francuske snage tamo na neki način nastoje to držati pod kontrolom. U bivšim sjevernoafričkim kolonijama danas djeluje više od 1100 francuskih firmi koji zapošljavaju 500.000 radnika. Francuska danas podržava neke od najrepresivnijih režima širom Sjeverne Afrike i Bliskog istoka. U Libiji podržava odmetnutog generala Halifu Haftara koji se bori protiv međunarodno priznate vlade u Tripoliju. U Egiptu Macron podržava generala Abdel Fattah el-Sisija, koga je više puta ugostio. U Saudijskoj Arabiji tjesno sarađuje sa princom Mohamedom bin Salmanom. Kao i u slučaju Egipta, akcent dvojice čelnika je na stabilnosti, sigurnosti i odbrani. Macron također ima bliske veze sa prijestolonasljednikom Abu Dhabija i de facto vladarom Ujedinjenih Arapskih Emirata, princom Mohamedom bin Zaidom. Dvije države imaju razvijenu saradnju kad je riječ o sigurnosti, odbrani, turizmu i trgovini. Podržava i brojne diktatore u zapadnoj Africi. Logika Pariza je jednostavna. Više im odgovara čvrsta autokratska ruka na Bliskom istoku i sjeveru Afrike nego demokratski izabran parlament. Idemo sada do Atlante gdje se nalazi Ali Younes, stručnjak za Bliski Istok. Ali, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, let me start by asking you, is France making a comeback in the Middle East? And why is its foreign policy becoming so assertive, as some will even say aggressive?
Yes, indeed. I think France has always been trying to inflict its political muscles in the Middle East because France feels this is its sphere of influence, especially in the Levant region, Lebanon and Greater Syria region, and North Africa, and other parts of Africa as well. And France feel it's been marginalized with the rising power of China that has inroads in Africa, and the U.S. foreign policy also has a lot of allies and dominant power in the global sense. So the French feel this is their domain and they have to intervene. Ironically, the French have always been intervening on the sides of the regimes who are friendly with. So the French and France, or this current government, have no friends, I believe, and for many people in this region, when it comes to the people of this region. They don't feel that France is on their side, where on one hand, French, they say this is on the side of democracy. They feel they left the slogan of liberalism and democratic governance and freedom for all people. But when it comes to the Muslim world or Africa, these slogans disappear. And, the French are more concerned of having allies and friends and selling multi-billion dollars of contracts, weapons with the autocratic or dictatorial regimes in Africa or in the Middle East.
But Ali, why is this always an issue with not only French leaders, but also with European and American leaders? Why is it easier doing business with Middle Eastern autocrats and generals than with a democratically elected parliament?
Because neither the French nor the Europeans nor the American governments have always been on the side of democratic governance in this region, in the Middle East or in Africa, despite the fact that they always say they want democracy. But the fact is that they have always used the issue of a human right as a leverage whenever it suited them, whenever they have an issue against this or that regime, for example, Iraq or China nowadays, which benefits the Muslim Uyghurs that the US on their side and criticize China, nevertheless. But as a matter of principle, I don't think no one thinks in this region that any Western government is really interested in democratic governance of this region. And the Middle East lags behind the entire world when it comes to democracy or freedom or liberty for its people. And as evident, the French, no difference than the Europeans or the Americans, they have always, prefer to do multi-billion worth of contracts, selling weapons to these regimes, and forget about the democracy, forget about the human rights of this region. And that's why the people, don't feel the French on their side, or the French are a principled party, and they are hypocritical when it comes to these issues.
Now, France had interests and a presence in the Levant and North Africa for more than a century. However, more recently, we see France courting Gulf leaders. How do you make sense of that?
Well, of course, France had a legacy. It's a nice term, had a legacy. But for the people of Algeria, the French have committed massacres and war crimes, and they have not yet to apologize.
More than 1 million civilians dead.
Yes, their 132-year of brutal occupation against the people of Algeria and Syria. They committed massacres against the Lebanese people when they sliced off Lebanon from Syria. So it's a legacy of divisions, legacy of war crimes in this region. And when it comes to the Gulf region, I think the French are interested in the business aspect of it. They try to exert influence through selling weapons and being friendly to the Gulf regions, and they're intervening in Libya, of course, because Libya in the south shores of the Mediterranean, and they have an interest in that. And Libya is a very wealthy country. It's not sub-Saharan Africa where poverty is the rule there. So Libya has a potential to have a lot of oil coming out of there, and it's a transit for migrant workers coming into Europe. So the French are intervening for their own best self-interests which is no one can fault them for that. But from the perspective of this region, the French are not friends of the Arab people or the Muslims, and especially with the latest hypocritical stance when advocating for democracy and liberalism. But when it comes to attacking the Muslim faith and the tenet of the Muslim people, the tenets of faith of the Muslim people, the French were attacking the Islamic faith and the Muslim world, right, accusing them of all kind of ugly accusations, unfounded accusations. So the French have no friends in this region, according to the perception of the people of the Arab world. And the
now, Ali, in the case of Libya is very interesting. France played an instrumental role in toppling Muammar Gaddafi back in 2011. However, today France supports renegade General Khalifa Haftar, who is fighting against a democratically elected and internationally recognized government in Tripoli. How do you explain that?
Yes, I mean, this is a case in point of a European country, a colonialist with a colonialist past. On one hand, at home says it is the bastion of democracy and freedom. But when it comes to an African country or an Arab country, they have a colonial mindset that they feel that they can replace or put this or that dictator in this country to serve their own best interest. So, we are in the 21st century. This is not the 1960s or the 19th century where the French, they could do whatever they want. People can hear, can listen, and they could see with their own eyes, the hypocritical stands of the French or other European countries. And this is quite unfortunate. And I think the French, they have the best interest, or any European country, to be on the side of the people, to advance human rights of this region, of the Middle East region, and to advance democratic governance, by siding with the people, not with the dictatorial regimes in the Middle East.
Right. And finally, Ali, do you see similarities in the way Emmanuel Macron wants to fight, and Sebastian Kurz, the way they want to fight Islamism, and the way the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Egyptians fight their own quote-unquote Islamists? In what way does the fear of Islamists draw the two sides closer?
So what does that Islamist mean? They put a term out there, Islamist, as a label to label anyone who is a good, peaceful, law-abiding citizen who happens to be a Muslim, who wants to practice his faith, in accordance with his own belief system, in accordance with his culture, as an Islamist. An Islamist is a term that is used if someone who is a Muslim and wants a democratic governance, or wants an election, what's a freedom, what's a liberty, So, the term Islamist or Islamism, I think this is a term, a label that has been used synonymous with terrorism. And this is not true. The Muslim world is vast, it's multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual. So anyone who wants democracy, they could be used as an Islamist. This is, I think this is unfortunate that the French and allied with the Arab regimes who are not interested in democracy at all, could use this label to tarnish and to taint anyone who is calling for democracy. I'm not saying that there are no terrorism, that there are no terrorists who happen to be Muslims. There are, and the Muslim people who are the first victims of terrorists who happen to be Muslims. But to paint the entire population or the entire faith as Islamist, and by way of insinuating that Islamism means terrorism, this is not true. This is unfortunate, and this should not be used in such way.
Right. Ali Younes, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Francuska je jedan od glavnih izvoznika oružja i vojne opreme u zemlje Sjeverne Afrike i Bliskog Istoka. Ko su joj najveći klijenti, saznajte u nastavku. Idemo sada do Istanbula gdje se nalazi Valeria Giannotta, profesorica međunarodnih odnosa. Valeria, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, let me start by asking you, how do you explain the rather belligerent stance France is taking against Turkey in a number of East Mediterranean disputes? Is this a clash of the titans?
Well, definitely there is such a component, as it was visible in the last tension that we recorded in the past month. On one side, we have the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who is portraying himself as the champion, as the defensor of some European values and liberal values. On the other side, we have Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, who is considered as the defender of the Islamist world. The tension became very visible in the last month after the cartoon that Charlie Hebdo published and the target before the Muslim world and in second hand Recep Tayyip Erdogan directly. Of course, before the personal traits, of these two presidents, there are some other concrete issues like the strategic interest and pivoting on the Middle East and in the Mediterranean area as well. So Turkey recently got pretty much disappointed against France. If we look at the situation in Syria, for example, France always supported the Kurdish militias, the Kurdish armed groups, right, that for Turkey are considered as the terrorist organization. And the Turkish administration got very much disappointed with the French president in organizing a sort of meeting by inviting the leader of these Kurdish groups as well. So as both member of NATO, there is this deep dividing line, which seems to become serious over time. And we shouldn't dismiss the fact that the French president Macron last year, by targeting Turkey, within the NATO frame, say that NATO is a sort of bad experiment. There is a sort of brain death affecting NATO nowadays. And he expressed over and over his personal disappointment towards Turkey. Of course, a long time, this disappointment has increased. As we can see along the tensions in Mediterranean, in the Nagorno-Karabakh, France has always taken some very harsh stance against Turkey. We shouldn't forget that in Ajaccio meeting last August, at the beginning of September, Macron definitely declared very clearly that Turkey shouldn't be considered a valuable Mediterranean partner anymore.
Even though Turkey has the longest sea coast of any country in the Eastern Mediterranean. But now, in the case of Libya, Libya is very important to France's foreign policy. Does France perceive Turkey as encroaching upon its own sphere of influence? Does France consider North Africa as its own backyard?
Definitely, there is this element as well. We shouldn't forget that back in the past, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, France took over the territories belonging and gravitating under the Ottoman Empire area of influence. And definitely, Turkey has some interest in Libya as well as Mediterranean country. We shouldn't forget that last November in 2019, Turkey and the national government of al-Sarraj, the internationally recognized government, signed two memorandum of understanding, one related to military issue and the second one for creating a sort of economic exclusive zone, a maritime agreement. That was a necessary agreement, actually, for Turkey to protect its own interest, and everything has to be read through the lens of the East Med project. Definitely, when we look at the situation in Syria, while the main international brokers of the conflict involved in the conflict are standing and supporting al-Sarraj government, on the other side, we have France who is supporting the warlord Haftar. Definitely. In order to, let's say, protect its own interest. And
Valeria,
by the way,
why would France, a European Union country that has that claims to be the bastion of human rights and democracy, be backing a renegade general whose forces have been accused of committing some of the worst human rights violations of the past 10 years?
Yes, this is correct. But on the other side, France has been perceived always as the cradle of civilization, European civilization. I mean, through the French Revolution, so the champion of some liberal values. Again, I mean, let me say, maybe it's not so politically correct, but when it comes to European Union and France, and when it comes to Turkey on the other side, there is unfortunately a sort of double standard approach. I mean, it's not a secret that French administration, now with Macron, before with Sarkozy, they had this sort of anti-Turkey stance, actually, that affected negatively even the Turkey accession process to the European Union. Unfortunately, when it comes to Europe and the European approach towards Turkey, there is always the solidarity principle, which becomes dominant. And France, as one of the leading and a founding member of European Union, pretty much support the principle of solidarity and carry out its own action and carry out the defense of European Union, European interest as well, as we say in the Mediterranean basin, right? Nowadays, there is a new alignment between Greece and France, which is becoming much more evident. And definitely the final purpose is to isolate further and further Turkey within the area as well, in order to protect, I mean, the interest of Greece. We shouldn't forget, by the way, that what's happening nowadays in the Mediterranean, what happens related to the hydrocarbons issues and so on, goes back to the past and goes back to a main mistake that European Union made back in 2005, 2004, when after the Annan plan related to the Cyprus issue and the division of the island, despite the fact that the Turkish side of Cyprus voted by supporting the international community solution, the Greek Cyprus rejected the plan, but they got rewarded as a full member of the European Union. And of course, this has created a sort of spillover, affecting negatively the Turkish accession process, affecting in a negative way even the resolution of the island. And finally, after years, more than 10 years, we got to this stuck point. I mean, we got here when Turkey is still isolated, and it will be further and further isolated. I mean, we shouldn't forget that France was one of the main broker of the East Med project along Cyprus, Greece, Israel, and some Emirates country as well. We shouldn't forget the declaration that they signed in Egypt last December, that it was pretty much against Turkey. I mean, the final aim was to further isolate Turkey. And by being isolated, Turkey, according to any realist principle, understanding of international politics, does not have any other chance rather than increase its tone in order to protect its own interest as well.
Now, Valeria, some observers seek to explain France's approach in the Middle East through the prism of mercantilism as a desire to secure lucrative export contracts for French companies. Is this oversimplified? And does Paris have greater interests, geopolitical interests in that part of the world?
Well, it can be oversimplified. I mean, there are some other components and factors to consider, but we shouldn't forget that in 2011, when France bombed Libya, I mean, in order to top down Gaddafi, it was just after the Libyan government signed some economic agreement with Italy, which is another important broker in Libya. So they signed several contracts, around $50,000, I mean, of contract. And
$50 million.
$50 million, of contract, and this was against France's interest. So behind the human rights, defense of the human rights, I mean, France, in that time there was Sarkozy, acted just for defending its own interest related to oil and any other sources. So whenever there is a source, there is always a stake, I mean, in any conflict. This is what the history teaches us. So it wouldn't be wrong to not consider actually the economic interest of France in the region, in Middle East, as in Libya, as in some other areas as well, by the way.
Right. Valeria, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you to you for the invitation.
Turska je ozbiljna geostrateška konkurencija Francuskoj na sjeveru Afrike, u Levantu i na Bliskom Istoku. Razilaženje stavova dvije članice NATO saveza uvlači i druge države u igru, a to se vidjelo formiranjem tabora između Francuske, Egipta, Emirata, Grčke i Kipra protiv Turske, Katara, Azerbejdžana, Turske republike Sjeverni Kipar i vlade u Tripoliju. Teško je predvidjeti kakav će biti rasplet geopolitičkog okršaja, ali je već jasno da su sve strane spremne pokazati i vojnu moć. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pogledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.